Yes, we
All
see
right.
it, and we just started the recording as well.
Awesome. And it's great to see everybody. I'm Tom Leddy. I'm from the architect relations team at Salesforce, and I'm an architect evangelist. You feel free to connect with me on Twitter, LinkedIn. And I know there's actually some familiar faces here. So if I haven't seen you before, it's great to meet you. And if I have, it's great to see you again. We're going to start with our favorite forward-looking statement slide that I'm sure we've all seen if you've been to any Salesforce event and seen any presentation from somebody at Salesforce. Make sure that you're making any purchasing decisions based on what's actually for sale and not on anything I say here. And let's talk about our agenda. So I'm going to give a quick overview of what my team is and what we do. And then we're going to get right into the discussion on record-triggered automations, and we'll talk about some key takeaways. We're going to talk about common use cases, and then some design considerations, and then I'm going to share some additional resources. So this being a presentation, there's only going to be so deep that we can go into it, but we do have a lot of great resources available on the Salesforce Architects website that I'm going to share. So from that, just a quick overview of our team. So the Salesforce Architect Relations team is, our vision is to activate, empower, and inspire architects. So we know that architects are trusted advisors who unlock new opportunities for Salesforce. And, we had some of this conversation at the beginning. You're the ones that are kind of leading the charge with, number one, the art of the possible for your business, but also making sure that everything fits together the right way and that your solution works overall. And you're also experienced practitioners. You're the key to short-term and long-term success of our customers. So whether you work for Salesforce, whether you work for a partner, whether you work for a customer, we've seen statistics that when an architect is involved in a project, the ROI increases dramatically, and the project, the chance of success increases dramatically. So it's great to see a lot of architects and aspiring architects. And our team exists to basically create the tools that will help you do your job better. So our team, you may recognize some of the faces on here. So Zane Turner is, she presents at a lot of, if you've been to TDX or Dreamforce and seen any architect presentation in the last few years, I'm sure you've seen Zane. Susanna Plaisted, her last name used to be Saint Germain. So her picture looks familiar, but the name doesn't. She got married recently. Mark Braga is actually for a while was running the CTA program, and then he moved over to our team and took a role on our team. And then we've got Marissa Lowe, who does a lot of our operations work, and myself. And that's the ones that make up our team. And we, Salesforce is investing in architects. So some of the things that we've done as a team over the last few years, in 2019, we launched our first architect track at Dreamforce, where we actually had our architect Vista. We had people coming in, and I think we were doing data model training and workshops back then. We've moved on to our well-architected framework and a few other things. But in 2020, we launched our architect.salesforce.com website, which if you haven't seen it, you should make sure to take a look at it. It's a great wealth of resources. It's got our well-architected framework that we talked about yesterday at the Austin user group meeting. It's got decision guides, which is one of the topics I'm going to be covering today, and then our diagram framework, which launched in 2021. So if you haven't seen that, it's tools to help you build better diagrams. So we've got a kit of parts and a shape library that you can get in Lucidchart, and soon to be also in Elements.cloud and Miro sometime within the next few months. And then last year we launched Salesforce Well Architected. So we keep evolving and coming out with additional tools, and Salesforce is continuing to invest in architects. So it's nice to be part of this team for sure. And now on to the main part of our discussion is record-triggered automations. So the first thing is, let's talk about what a record-triggered automation is. It is basically some type of automated process that fires in response to a record being created, updated, deleted, modified in some form, as opposed to somebody executing like a screen flow, for example. And the key takeaways, we're going to talk a lot of about a lot of different scenarios and things in this discussion, but this slide here really, tells you what you need to know if you don't remember anything else from this discussion. So Flow and Apex are the preferred no-code and pro-code solutions for triggered automations. And the reason that is the top bullet point is because I know there's still some orgs out there that are using workflow rules and process builders, and people are hopefully actively trying to migrate off of those because they're being deprecated, and support's being pulled for them pretty quickly. But if you're not already thinking, Flow and Apex should be your go-to solutions for record triggered automations. If you're doing same record field updates, that's where you would want to use before save flow triggers, which are fairly new. I mean, they've been around for a little while, but they're still fairly new. And then after save flow triggers are for other declarative automations. And then when you need to do high performance batch processing that has really complex logic, Apex is actually should be the preferred tool. And as we get into the next few slides, we're going to kind of compare scenarios where, sometimes it actually is better to use Apex than Flow, even though you'll see a lot of our documentation that kind of says you should always prefer declarative automations to over code whenever you can. But the truth is it's knowing what the right tool is to use for the right job. So there's sometimes when Flow is the best tool, and there's sometimes when Apex is the best tool. And then utilize subflows to make your automations reusable and easier to maintain. And this actually kind of ties in with our well-architected framework, where we talk about composability and designing good automations. So there used to be a kind of a rule that everyone would know about, and it's even in a lot of our documentation, where we would talk about one automation per object. That's all that you should ever do. And that actually was really good advice back when we had process builder and workflow rules and some of these other types of automations where you couldn't really control the way that the automation is executed, and that one automation project rule was there for a reason. But the platform has evolved and matured a lot, especially over the last few years, where there are a lot of tools available. So, there's Flow Orchestrator, but there's also subflows. I know Orchestrator is a paid product. And then you have things like when you have record triggered automations, you can set the priority of which flows execute where. And then there's other things like asynchronous paths, and there's just a lot more options for you to control the way that your automations execute. So make sure that you're modularizing your flows and making your automations more reusable and easier to maintain. And next, let's talk about some common trigger use cases. So here's a nice table. We're going to dig into this a little bit more, but basically what this is, and this is right out of our record triggered automation decision guide, which I'm going to walk through at the end of this slide deck. But basically, to give you an idea, it's anything in green that says available means that that is a good, it's available, meaning you can do it, and it's actually a good option for this use case. If you go down the left-hand column, if you see something that says not ideal, it basically says it's technically possible to use this tool to do this thing, but it's not the best way to do it. There's a lot of considerations, and you should really be thinking about, if you see, like, for example, an after save flow trigger being used to make a same record field update, you might want to ask yourself, is this really the best way to be doing it? Or, should we be thinking more about it before save trigger? And then not available just means that at least for the foreseeable future, it's not supported, and there's no plans to support it. So, and sometimes, if you notice, there's a few lines, or a lot of lines actually, where there's multiple tools that are available for the same use case. So in that case, what we recommend is to choose the tool that will allow you to implement and maintain this use case with the lowest cost. And that's going to depend on a lot of different variables, but one of them is actually going to be the makeup of your team. So if you have a lot of Apex developers, and you've already got a really well-established CI/CD pipeline and a well-managed framework for handling Apex triggers, then yeah, absolutely, go continue on that path. But on the other hand, if you don't really have consistent access to developer resources, you don't really have a good like organizational culture of code quality, you might be better to think about using triggered flows that more people can maintain, and instead of worrying about trying to have somebody write code that might be difficult to maintain over the long term. And then if you've got a mixture of skill sets, depending on the size of the organization, some larger organizations do. Flow triggers do combine. They provide a compelling option, and they're a little bit more performant, and they're easier to debug and maintain than any of our no-code offerings that we had in the past. So, when you think about some of those older process builder and workflow rules, they were really limited with what you could do with them. But Flow has evolved so much that it is actually it's a lot more flexible, and it performs a lot better than a lot of those other tools have in the past. So if we dig into this, we're going to go do a little bit of a deeper dive. So when we think about same field record updates, so you can see we can do this with a before flow trigger and with an Apex trigger. You can do it, there's a couple other ways to do it also that are not really ideal, but the biggest takeaways from this specifically is stop using workflow rules and process builders for this. I know I've said this a few times, but we're really trying to push this because we know we still have customers that are doing this. So, but using before save flow triggers or before save Apex triggers instead will be not only give you more options for what you can do with the same field record update, but it'll also be over the long term. It's aligns with Salesforce's direction, and it's easier to maintain. So. Basically what this, the reasons for this is, so the records field values are already loaded in memory, and they don't need to be loaded again. The updated is performed by changing the values of the record in memory, and then it relies on the original underlying DML operation to save the changes to the database, which avoids an expensive DML operation and a recursive save. So, both of these two options that say available will do that. And then tests, our own internal tests show that the execution times for before save flow triggers are 10 to 20 times faster than workflow rules or process builder. So the main limitation on before save flow triggers is around functionality. So you can query records, you can loop, you can evaluate formulas, you can assign variables and add some logic for decisions, but you can only make updates to the underlying record. So you cannot extend a before save flow trigger with Apex for invocable actions or subflows. So if you do need to do something like that, that's where going the Apex route might be a little bit better. You can pretty much do anything you want in a before save Apex trigger, so if we move on from that, high performance batch processing. So the ideal way to do this is with Apex triggers. If you see, you can do this with Flow. It's just not the best use case. And we can see, some of the example scenarios are, defining and evaluating complex logical expressions, loading and transforming data from large number of records, and, looping over, having a bunch of nested loops. Anything that requires like a map like or set like functionality, and then transaction save points. So Flow's formula engine, it sporadically exhibits poor performance when it's resolving some of these extremely complex formulas, and in batch use cases that issue is a little bit more exacerbated. So that's why we don't recommend using Flow for this. And then Flow does not support the map data type. So if you have to do that, you would have to use Apex. And it also doesn't support transaction save points. So those are two scenarios of where Apex is really your only option. And moving on from there, cross-object CRUD. So creating, updating, or deleting a different record other than the original one that triggered the transaction. It requires a database option, so no matter what tool you use, you're going to end up doing a DML operation. The only tool that doesn't currently support that is the before save flow trigger. Currently, Apex, I would say in raw database operation speed, technically it outperforms Flow, but the difference is really negligible. So that's where it comes down to you can choose either tool you want, and performance wise, you're going to get about the same results. So you need to think about what your team makeup is and who's available to make updates long term and everything. If you are looking for major performance improvements, like if you find that one of these is not performing well, you would be better off by identifying and fixing inefficient user implementations before looking into optimizing the lower level operations. So, and the execution of the actual logic on the app server, it consumes more time than the handling of database operations. So that's why you're better off optimizing your underlying processes than trying to figure out how to optimize something between Flow and Apex. And complex list processing. So this is another one where an after save flow trigger or plus Apex or an Apex trigger, right? So in-place data transformations, sorting and filtering, those things can be a little bit cumbersome to achieve in Flow. They're much more straightforward in Apex. And you should consider invocable Apex. If you haven't seen that, used before, you should definitely look into the options for using it. And we actually cover it a little bit in the record trigger automation decision guide. There's no way to reference an item in a Flow collection. So like either by an index or using the Flow's loop functionality. So you can't do in Flow, anything that you would use like my list, bracket my list item variable to do in Apex, you would not be able to do in Flow. So that's one of the reasons why Apex is always some kind of combination of either by itself and combined with Flow for this type of scenario. And then loops are executed serially during runtime, even during batch processing. So any SOCL and DML operations which are enclosed within a loop are not bulkified, and they add risk that the corresponding transaction governor limits are going to be exceeded. So that's another reason why you might want to look at using Apex where you can do that bulkification. One of the again, so this is where flows and invocable Apex can really shine. So Apex methods that handle list processing logic are declared as invocable methods, so they're automatically made available to Flow users. And this helps keep business logic implementation in the tool that business-facing users can use without forcing developers to implement functional logic. So the idea is that you can have developers implementing some of this complex logic in the background and then using a Flow for the front-end business logic to invoke it. And actually, if you don't mind, I need to step away for about 2 minutes and I'll be right back if that's okay. Sorry.
Not a problem. I see your question there, Jose. Let me post a link to the architect.salesforce.com website. It's also on the event details. I think you will find it interesting. Yeah, thank you, Pranav.
All right, sorry about that.
Not a
Uh,
problem.
all right, so asynchronous processing was the next item, and here both Flow and Apex can handle this, uh, and they the idea is solutions for executing logic asynchronously. So it would be use cases that require separate transactions, or maybe external callouts, or something that's just going to take too long, where you don't want somebody sitting at their computer waiting for a process to finish, right? So there are a couple of considerations. So in Apex, you're going to want to implement asynchronous processing inside of a queuable Apex class. Apex has more complex error handling, including the ability to intentionally trigger a failure case. In Flow, there's a run asynchronously path in after save flows that you can achieve a similar result in a low code manner. And then Flow offers a fixed amount of retries and some basic error handling via its fault path. Apex, it has a little bit more advanced error handling, so it might be something to consider. But for mixed use cases, you can call there's a system in queue job that you can call against queuable Apex from within an invocable Apex, and then you can invoke the method from Flow with there's an invocable action framework that you can use, and from there. So custom validation errors, you pretty much have to use Apex triggers. Flow does not provide a way to either prevent DML operations from committing or to throw custom errors. The add error Apex method is it's not supported when executed from Flow, even when you're doing invocable Apex. So if you need custom validation errors, your only option there is going to be to use an Apex trigger. And from there. So some of the design considerations, right? So performance and ordering, they used to be the main reasons. Like I said, you would recommend building one process per object. But consolidating an automation into a single flow doesn't have any impact compared to multiple flows. Now that you can order, there's flow trigger ordering, there's entry conditions, and then, like I said, there's even other tools like Orchestrator, but there's no performance hit by using these types of tools, right? So and entry conditions can actually lead to performance improvements over for record triggered automations if they're used to exclude changes that would not impact specific use cases. And flow trigger ordering was introduced in spring 22, so just about a year ago. You can assign a priority value to flows and then guarantee their execution order, which was something that you didn't used to be able to do. And that's why, that was one of the reasons people would build these kind of giant monolith flows, because they had to have be able to guarantee execution order, but that's not really a concern anymore. And so I would say this priority, value, it's not an absolute value. So the way that it works is you set the values in whatever priority you think, so they don't have to be numbered sequentially, but the flow will execute in whatever order it's described. And if there's two priority ones, for example, they'll execute alphabetically based on the name of the flow. So but you can order things something like 10, 20, 30, and then that way, if you build a new flow at some point later that may need to execute in the middle of 10 and 20, you can number it 15. So you can think of it that way, but it's essentially, it's a field when you're building a flow that you can assign a priority to it. And then flows that don't have a trigger order. So once we launch this functionality, any flows that you already had in your system, they will run by default between numbers 1000 and 1001 to allow for backwards compatibility. But you could always, you don't have to deactivate it and create a new version of the flow, but you can always give it a new order if you need to. But if you want to leave them alone, you can, what you can do is with any new flows, you can start ordering them at 1001 for the ones you want to run after them, and give the priority of something before 1000 for the ones you want to run before. And then as a best practice, like I was saying, you could, leave space in between the flows that you number, so that if you add another flow in the future, you could give it a number in between the two that where it needs to execute. And flow bulkification. So do not include DML and SOCWL in loops. And really, it says flow bulkification, but the truth is you shouldn't be doing that in Apex either. So the flow runtime, it automatically performs cross-batch bulkification on behalf of the user, but it does not perform any functional bulkification. And that means that if you build your own loops and it includes some type of DML or SOCWL in it, the runtime isn't going to optimize that for you. So, the following elements, can cause consumption of DML and SOCWL in triggered flows, which are, create or delete records. So each create or delete records element consumes one DML for the entire batch, not including any downstream DML caused by triggers on the target object. Get records, each element consumes one SOCWL for the entire batch. So if you're getting a group of records, it's one SOCWL statement. Action calls it's going to depend on how the action is implemented. So during runtime, the flow runtime will compile a list of inputs across all of the relevant flow interviews in the batch, and then it passes that list into a bulk action call. But from that point, it's up to you as an action developer to ensure that the action is properly bulkified. So that was kind of like I was saying, the runtime was only going to optimize so much for you, and if you use poor design in your flows or even an Apex, it's that'll end up being on you, and you're gonna have to go and track something down if it's not performing well. And then a loop, don't consume any DML or SOCWL directly. Instead, it overrides those first rules, the first three boxes above, by executing each contained element in the loop serially for each flow interview in the batch one by one. So this is where it escapes the flow's automatic cross-batch bulkification. So there's no DML or SOCWL in a loop that's shared across save order trees. So the number of records in a batch has it multiplies the effect on the amount of DML and SOCWL consumed. So anytime you've got a loop that has a DML in it, it's going to execute that DML statement each time the loop runs for is the easiest way to put that statement that I just said, and that's going to especially for large numbers of records, that's going to lead to quite a bit of performance issues and slowdowns. And from there, what I really wanted to do, so those are some slides, and I know I kind of breezed through a lot of that, but what I wanted to get to is you can find all of this information and even more detailed information about some of the performance tests I mentioned in the Architect's Guide to Record Triggered Automation on Salesforce, which is right here. And let me see. I think I need to change the screen that I'm sharing. Right there. There we go. So you can find this. It's on architect.salesforce.com. And if you go under decision guides, you will see a record triggered automation one. We've actually got a number of other ones for data integration and event-driven architecture that you may not be aware of. And if you're not, you should definitely check them out. It's got a variety of, it's got some of these same takeaways we talked about at the beginning and some of these same tables about when to use what. But it actually goes into a lot more detail than what I was able to cover in this presentation, because this is such a dense topic, and understanding even like the right time to use a record triggered automation and then the right tool to use to implement it. There can be a lot to it. So let's it goes down and does a lot of the a lot more detail than I went into about each one of these different scenarios and why you should use each tool. And one of the other things that you will find towards the end also is some of our own performance tests that we've done internally on where we've compared Flow and Apex. to discuss the speed and performance and everything. So you can find all that information in this guide, and it's got a lot of great charts and graphs, but it's got some good details where if as an architect you have to have a discussion with somebody about why you should be using one tool over another for a given scenario, there's a lot of great material here that you can reference in regards to what's going to perform better than what else, and as well as, like I said, those same tables and the discussions about what is or isn't supported. One of the other great resources that we have available is the Salesforce Architects blog, which you can also find on architect.salesforce.com under Connect and our blog. And then the actual blog itself is on Medium. Let me see if it actually, I think when it shares, it doesn't let me share the entire screen. So let me go back to that. There we go. So these, they're a series of blog posts that are written by architects. There's a lot of great posts about automations, and there's some about record-triggered automations. You'll be able to find that in here. There's a lot of great resources in here that'll help you with some of these decisions and discussions about how to build these things well. And they're written by other architects in the community. And in fact, it's a shameless promotion, but if anybody here is interested in submitting a blog post, we actually have an open call for content that goes through the end of March. And there's instructions on the website about how to submit your own blog posts as well. So if you are interested in writing for us, we would love to hear from you. And I think with that, let me see, what other resources did we have? Oh, our Salesforce Architects YouTube channel, which has a... We have been recently really pushing a lot of videos about our well-architected framework and diagram frameworks. But if you haven't, if you haven't seen these, you can check out. We've got a lot of great resources here. Not as much on specifically record-triggered automations, although there are some great videos, some of the older ones where we've had some discussions about integrations and just automations in general that you can find if you scroll through some of our older Trailhead Live videos as well. And I think that is a great comparison of how to think about invocable actions. It's a way to run code as part of your flow. So basically what you end up doing, and that's a good link with the unofficial Salesforce, but it's essentially you're building a flow, and then if you're not a developer, but you have, a developer who can create some Apex. So let's say you get to a point where your flow, you reach the limits of what you're able to do with flow, but you can do something in code. You can have your flow actually execute that code now, which is not something that was originally available within flow, but has become a great tool to use. You should use the scissor in the well-architected simple video. So that would be this one. Yes. I tried to, so I had this idea for a series of videos that I used common everyday objects to describe complex architecture topics. And one of them was a Swiss Army knife versus the scissors. I think my favorite video in this series might be the blowtorch one, where I got to set some things on fire. So if you haven't seen these yet, Susanna and I made a bunch of them. So hope you enjoy them. Make sure to check them out. And can you get a copy of the slide deck? Yes, I saw that. I will be happy to share that after this session, and and I'll actually share the information. Like I said, is all in the decision guide as well. But I'll share the deck also, so you can have both. And then going over the difference between using Apex for batch process and a scheduled triggered flow. So we have traditionally we have looked at least for high performance batch processing, we're still recommending using Apex triggers for that, just because of the complicated logical expressions for formulas and everything. But I will say that if you're doing like a scheduled flow and you're planning on running it at a time when and you don't have a lot of complicated processing that needs to get done as part of the as part of what you're executing, I think that works as well. That'll work as well. And I don't know if that, hopefully, Felicia, hopefully that answered your question. And let's see, any other, would love, if anybody else has any other questions, would love to talk through. Does async flow have any limits, or does it affect any limits? Yeah, that's actually a really good question, and it does. So the short answer is it does. The longer answer is, let me see here. Give me 1 second here, and I've got a specific answer for you on limits. So async execution, some of the constraints are, it's not infinite. So you are still beholden to the same daily limits that you are. So that's actually one of the biggest concerns for executing async. Honestly, whether it's Flow or Apex, is if you're launching a bunch of these asynchronous processes, and just to give anybody an idea of what async actually means, if you aren't familiar with it, the idea is that you start one process and then you kind of hand it off to another process that when you make the handoff, that process kind of takes it and runs with it, and you're not necessarily waiting for a result to come back. And some of the use cases and the reasons why you might want to do that is it increases scalability. You can spread a bunch of unrelated tasks or tasks that can execute in parallel out among a bunch of different processors, so things can perform faster. You can unblock UI effects while UI requests while something else is running in the background. And then you can handle data in bulk or make external callouts that way. But there are a couple constraints. So one of them is limits. The other one to think about is async requests. A lot of people don't realize this. So when you see an async path in Flow, the actual async path won't start running until the parent request completes. So the async path itself is not running in parallel. It's just that if you have a bunch of other async processes, they can run in parallel with each other. And then there are a few other things you need to think about, like if you launch an async process, does it throw any errors like system timeout, too many SQL? So async would, because at the end of the day, you're still executing another process in the system. One of the things you can do with async processing is an external call out to another system. So in that case, that system would have whatever errors it would have. But one of the things about async is if you have like a human user that's sitting at a computer waiting for a response from an async process, usually you're better off sticking with something synchronous, because what happens when async is you kind of hand something off to this other process that you're calling. It's going to go off and execute it, and it's going to take its time. It might not execute it right away. So your answer of will they throw those types of errors? They will, but they won't return them back to the UI. They'll get the process might just kind of die or hang or something, and you might not know about it. So that is actually one of the considerations with async. And Glenn, can async flows chain? Need more information about what you're trying to do. So you can launch multiple processes async, but they would kind of run in parallel.
So it won't be like queuable, right? One async flow finishes, which also again calls another async flow one after the other.
You could do that, yeah. That would just be like you could do that. Yeah.
So guys, actually a follow-up on that question is, what if we have like 3 record trigger flows queued to run at 1, 2, 3? All 3 have async paths. Will the 3 async paths also run in that order, or they'll just be parallelly running whenever the system is accepting it?
They'll be parallel running whenever the system is accepting it. Yeah. If we use Flow Explorer to order our flows, where can we find the metadata for the ordering? That would be within each flow, and you'd be looking at the priority of the flow. I'm going to stop sharing here. It doesn't actually modify the flow. It's more of the runtime engine behind the scenes. When it's getting ready to execute flows, it's going to take that order into consideration and execute them in the right order. But it doesn't actually make any changes to what the flow itself is doing, if that makes sense. Sure. And Deep raised a hand.
Yeah. So hi, Tom. This is Deep. So I have one issue actually. Right now in our organization, we have an object whose automation or any processing is completely dependent on Apex trigger, and we keep adding some codes frequently. And now it is quite getting heavy and like lengthy. So we have few complex logics that we can't transform completely into flow. So how do you suggest to transfer few logics in the flow as well as keep the apex trigger? Do we need to keep some checks or tips for like order of processing?
Yeah, you would need to make sure. Yeah, I mean, you would need to break that down and make sure that you're not breaking any logic, as far as things needing to process in a certain order. And I think the question is, do you know why you would want to keep some things in Apex versus breaking it up into a series of smaller flows, or is there?
Yeah, we do have few complex logics in that which which cannot go into flow.
Okay.
But yeah, since like the trigger is getting quite bigger
Yeah.
day by day, a lot of methods getting, just developers keep adding the methods due to few requirements. So I was like, thinking after seeing your this recording, like if we can achieve something into flow and
So there are a couple options that you can think about there. So one would be, rather than having one giant trigger that's just got all this code in it, is even creating smaller triggers and using, there are trigger frameworks you can use that control the order of execution. That might be one thing if you have a lot of developers that like to, that are good developers and they like to write triggers. Having one big monolith trigger is not the best, right? You're exactly right about that. But you could also do a mixture of like a parent flow with some subflows and then invocable Apex, like we were talking about earlier. That could be an option too. And the benefit there is, then your flow, you could have admins working on the overall logic that is kind of controlled by the flow. And then when you've got that complex logic, you could have the flow using invocable Apex to call that. So if you wanted to do that combination, or if you want to stick with Apex, if you've got a really strong development team, then maybe using a trigger framework would be a better route to go to.
Got you. Thank you. Thanks for your
Sure.
answer.
Hey Tom, this is Glenn. My question about the Flow Explorer was more because if I set the order of my flows using Flow Explorer, now I want to be able to deploy that order into another org, right? So I need to be able to pull the metadata from somewhere so I can deploy it.
Oh yeah. Deploying flows is always a fun experience. And yeah, I'll have to follow up with you on that one about where you can actually find the metadata and how you would move that from one environment to another. Off the top of my head, I'm not sure, but I can reach out to our flow PM and see if I can find that for you.
Awesome, thank you.
But yeah, traditionally, and we have been making some strides and some improvements in this area, but that was one of the other considerations for using flow in the past was it was always really hard to package up flows and deploy them. But we're moving forward. We're hopefully moving in the right direction on that. So. Any other questions? And thanks, Jared. Yeah, there's this is an interesting topic. So there's always a lot to learn on this. And if you notice, even the decision guide, it's really long. Like it's pretty dense, but it has a lot of good information. But it takes a lot. And then the other thing is we keep adding more functionality to Flow because we're trying to, as an organization, we want to make it as easy to do declarative development as possible so that, you don't have to have a bunch of people that are writing Apex to solve every problem. But can we talk about test coverage for flows? Yes. So this is new. So up until recently, testing was not required for flows the way that it was for Apex. So, Apex, you can't deploy an Apex class if you don't have a test class, for example. Flows, we are just adding the option now to be able to add test coverage for flows. It's still, to my knowledge, not required as much of it's a recommended best practice. My guess is in the future, it is going to become required because one of the things that's starting to happen now that we're seeing is the more functionality we add to Flow and the more flexible we make it, it's really great because there's a lot of things you can do with Flow that you couldn't do even a couple of years ago. But it's getting dangerously close to you can do almost all the same things you can do with Flow that you can do with Apex, and it's a lot easier to break things now. So if you think about Flow back in maybe 2015, 2016 timeframe, going back 7-8 years, you could make some screens and go through and retrieve, maybe update some records or something like that. And, it was really simple operations that you could do. And as it's evolved, you can loop over big collections of records. You can bulk, you can update records. And, if you're allowing somebody to just go directly into production and modify a flow, which is what people used to do all the time, you can trash your system pretty quickly without even, and sometimes what it is you'll have like a brand new admin that's not really used to, thinking through the logic of how a flow needs to work. And, it looks easy because you can drop some boxes on a screen and connect them with arrows and everything. And the next thing you know, you've corrupted a bunch of records. So we've started adding and encouraging people to do more testing with Flow. And like I said, there's no hard requirement now to have a certain level of test coverage like there is with Apex. But I think that's also just because the being able to unit test flows is a newer concept. And I don't know this for sure, a safe harbor and everything, but just based on what I've heard from our product teams, I have a feeling that as time goes on, that actually at some point will become required, and then you'll have the same requirements for testing that you have with Apex. Oh, thank you. Thanks for coming, for everybody.
Absolutely, and thank you, Tom, for this. This was very insightful. It's actually the gold mine that you showed us with the resources that you shared.
Oh,
absolutely. It's kind of. I'm going to bookmark those links. I'm kind of searching on the side. I'm going to bookmark those for myself.
Yeah. What I'm going to do, actually, let me put these in the chat, and I'm going to share like I said, I'm going to share the deck and everything. There is this. This is our YouTube channel. And then let's see, what else have we got? Our and then our blog. And there are a lot of other things. In fact, let me share my screen one more time. So if let me know when you're able to see that. There we go. So if we go to the Salesforce Architects website, we have our decision guides that we kind of talked about, and there's our record triggered automation. There's a couple other resources that I think will be really useful. So under our resources tab, we have this document that's called the Platform Multi-Tenant Architecture. This contains a bunch of information about how Salesforce works under the hood. So these are all the things that, as an architect, you will not have control over yourself. It's what the system is doing foundationally, but it's really good to know this information. So this is like when you create a new object and add it to your data model, like what is actually going on behind the scenes, or when you do searching, when you run a query, for example, and we talked about things like SOQL and how is the system actually processing that query, and what is the database actually doing, and how what is it doing when you're searching and using like SOSL, for example, or why do we encourage bulkifying your operations? This is all in here, and like I said, so these are the things that as an architect you wouldn't be able to control yourself. It's all the code that our engineering team wrote, but understanding how these things work is going to be invaluable when you're thinking about like, well, how do we want to build? What is the best way to build an automation? And if we are thinking about doing some kind of complex logic, is there something in here that we should be thinking about that we should be taking into consideration before we build something a certain way? So this is really good information to know. And actually, here, let me share this as well. I think I went to it. Yeah, there we go. And then the other thing is within our well-architected framework. And I've actually given a few presentations about this to other user groups. So if you may have seen it before, and if not, it's basically our best practices for architecture in general. So how to build a really healthy Salesforce solution. And it's organized in these pillars that we call trusted, easy, and adaptable. So we talk about security and compliance, reliability, specifically automation. Since we're talking about record triggered automations, there is an entire chapter that's an entire white paper about building good automations. And in here is where we talk about having good logic, thinking about transaction handling and executing things in like system context versus user context, for example, making sure you've got good error handling, and knowing when to execute things synchronously versus asynchronously. We talked about that. So we've got a lot of that information is in automated under well architected. So let me share that as well. And then the well-architected framework in general has a lot of the things that, like if you look at our composable chapter, that's where we talk about building your architecture in modular building blocks as opposed to building monoliths and things like that. So those are some other resources that you can find. So
nice. Any other questions? Anyone? Okay. I'm gonna stop the recording. We'll hang out here, but I'm just gonna stop recording.
sounds good.